Somewhere in the black water off the coast of southern Iran, close to a naval base called Bandar Abbas, three small shapes moved across the surface of the Persian Gulf. No engines roaring overhead, no missile trail lighting up the sky. Just three boats, low and quiet, cutting through the dark toward one of the most heavily guarded pieces of coastline in the country. None of them had a crew. None of them were built to come back. And by the time the sun rose over the Strait of Hormuz, a facility Iran had relied on for years was in ruins, and the United States military had just done something it had never done before in its entire history. If you're enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to Cartovex Media because the next few minutes completely change the picture. Here's what almost nobody outside the defense world understood in that first hour. This wasn't a missile strike, it wasn't a fighter jet. It was a machine that floated, steered itself, carried an explosive payload, and detonated on a target with no human being anywhere near it when it happened. Three of them, built by a company most people had never heard of. And for the first time in American military history, they had just been used to kill in combat, on the water, against a real enemy. But to understand why this moment matters as much as it does, you have to rewind. Because this strike didn't come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a fragile peace that had already been quietly falling apart for weeks. Let's go back to where this current chapter really began. Early this year, after a punishing air campaign against Iran's nuclear military infrastructure, the United States and Iran reached an uneasy truce. A ceasefire took hold in April. A follow-up memorandum was signed roughly a month later, laying out 60 days to negotiate something more permanent. For Washington, it was a chance to pull back forces that had been stretched across the region for months. For Tehran, it was supposed to be proof that it could behave like a responsible actor inside one of the most valuable waterways on the planet. For a while, it held. Then it didn't. In early July, Iranian forces struck commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, including a tanker carrying liquefied natural gas. Tehran claimed the ships had ignored warnings and used unauthorized routes. But the deeper explanation was simpler and far more dangerous. Iran appears to have reinterpreted a single clause in the memorandum, a line about ensuring safe passage for commercial shipping, and twisted it into something closer to a toll booth. Under this new interpretation, a ship that didn't check in with Iranian forces first could become a target. Washington's response was immediate. The Treasury Department moved to revoke a license that had allowed Iran to sell oil. President Trump declared the ceasefire over, and United States Central Command, the military command responsible for the entire Middle East, began launching a new wave of retaliatory strikes. The first night hit roughly 80 targets, the next night closer to 90. By the fourth consecutive night, the cumulative total had climbed past 300 targets struck across southern Iran. Missile sites, radar installations, drone facilities, and the fast attack boat bases the Iranian Navy relies on to threaten shipping in the strait. But here's what almost nobody was watching for. Buried inside those strike numbers was something categorically different from anything that came before it. On the night of July 12th, CENTCOM used unmanned surface vessels, sea drones, as an actual strike weapon for the first time in the history of American warfare. Three Saronic Corsair drones slipped into the waters near Bandar Abbas naval base under cover of darkness. Their target, a submarine and ship maintenance facility, along with what appears to have been a Ghadir-class midget submarine sitting in a dry dock gantry at the pier. These boats weren't there to patrol. They weren't there to gather intelligence and quietly withdraw. Each one carried an explosive payload, and each one was on what the military calls a one-way mission. Once launched, there was no recall. It was going to hit something, or it was going to fail trying. It didn't fail. CENTCOM confirmed the strike the following day in a short but historic statement, describing it as the first time American forces had ever employed sea drones in combat operations. 11 words, and with them, one era of naval warfare quietly closed while another one opened. Now, if you followed this war closely, you might be asking why this is such a big deal. The United States has used aerial drones throughout this entire conflict. Reaper drones, one-way attack drones, low-cost systems designed to overwhelm enemy air defenses. Drones in the sky are old news at this point. But a drone in the water, purpose-built to deliver a lethal payload directly into an enemy naval base, that's a genuinely new frontier. And the story of how the U.S. got here says a lot about how quickly modern warfare has changed in just a few short years. To understand where this capability actually came from, you have to look somewhere that, on paper, has nothing to do with Iran at all: Ukraine. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began, Ukraine has faced an opponent with one of the largest navies on Earth and almost no traditional navy of its own to answer with. So Ukrainian engineers improvised. They built small, fast, unmanned boats packed with explosives, essentially floating bombs that could be steered remotely toward Russian warships at high speed. They were cheap, they were expendable, and they worked far better than almost anyone expected. Ukrainian sea drops have been credited with sinking or severely damaging a string of Russian vessels in the Black Sea, forcing Moscow to pull much of its most valuable hardware away from occupied Crimea entirely. It became one of the most lopsided cost exchanges of the entire war, a few $1,000s in hardware disabling warships worth tens, sometimes hundreds of millions. American defense planners noticed. And so did the people worried about a much larger, much more distant problem: China's rapidly expanding fleet in the Pacific. If a country with almost no navy could humble part of a major maritime power using cheap unmanned boats, what could the United States build if it took the same idea seriously, at scale? That question set off roughly 2 years of accelerated development inside the Pentagon. The Navy didn't bet on a single design. Reporting indicates it evaluated proposals from at least half a dozen manufacturers, Saronic among them, before a company based in Texas emerged with a platform called the Corsair. 24 feet long, a reported payload capacity of around 1,000 pounds, a range beyond 1,000 nautical miles, a top speed above 35 knots. By this spring, the company had reportedly built several hundred of them, and the U.S. Navy had already signed a production contract to scale the platform further. But here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. This wasn't the Corsair's first appearance in this war, and it wasn't born as a weapon at all. Back in June, an American AH-64 Apache helicopter went down in the Gulf of Oman after taking Iranian fire. 2 crew members were in the water, in hostile territory, in the middle of an active conflict zone. The vessel that helped get them out wasn't a traditional warship or rescue helicopter. It was a Saronic Corsair, operated by a Navy element known as Task Force 59, which had been quietly fielding these drones in the region since late March. A machine with no one aboard helped bring American aviators home alive. At the time, that story barely made headlines. It was framed as a quiet, remarkable footnote, the first known instance of an unmanned surface vessel assisting directly in a personnel rescue. Nobody was thinking about it as a preview of anything larger. Except it was, because weeks later, the exact same class of boat that once helped save American lives in that stretch of water became the weapon that struck deep into Iranian naval infrastructure. The same hull, the same autonomy stack, one mission built around rescue, the other built around destruction, depending entirely on what the moment demanded. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone thinking about the future of naval warfare. This isn't a single-purpose weapon. It's a flexible, reusable platform that can carry a rescue litter 1 month and an explosive charge the next. So let's talk about what actually happened during the strike itself, because the details tell you almost everything about how deliberate this operation really was. The target wasn't a random stretch of coastline. It was the submarine and ship maintenance facility of Bandar Abbas Naval Base, one of Iran's most significant naval installations, sitting directly along the Strait of Hormuz. This is the kind of facility that keeps an entire fleet running. It's where damaged vessels get repaired, where fast attack boats get service between operations, and, according to footage later released by CENTCOM, where a Ghadir-class midget submarine sat suspended in a dry dock gantry the night the drones arrived. Hitting a target like that isn't about a single dramatic explosion. It's about degrading Iran's capacity to sustain its harassment campaign in the Strait over the long term. You can eventually replace a single boat. It's much harder and much slower to replace the infrastructure that keeps an entire fleet operational. And here's the part that makes this weapon so different from everything that came before it. Traditional airstrikes leave a signature. Radar can sometimes catch an inbound jet. Heat sensors can detect a missile launch. Air defense crews train for years to identify those signals and react in time. A small, low, fast-moving boat skimming across dark water is a completely different problem. It's harder to detect on radar because of its size and profile. It doesn't produce the thermal signature of a jet engine, and by the time anyone on the ground identifies it as a threat, if they identify it at all, it may already be too late to stop. CENTCOM's own footage of the strike reportedly shows the 3 Corsairs making a slow, uncontested approach to the pier before detonating. No visible resistance, no apparent warning, just 3 shapes moving quietly across the water until they weren't there anymore. It's worth being honest here about what remains uncertain. CENTCOM has not publicly disclosed full technical specifications for the Corsair's payload or performance in this specific operation, and some figures reported by outlets citing the manufacturer should be treated as informed estimation rather than official confirmation. What is confirmed, based on CENTCOM's own statement and corroborating reporting from multiple independent defense outlets, is that the strike happened, that it marked the first combat use of an unmanned surface vessel in American military history, and that it was part of a broader, well-documented campaign that struck more than 300 targets across Iran over the course of roughly 1 week. Now here's where the story stops being about one facility and starts being about the entire balance of power in the region. The moment CENTCOM's statement went public, it rippled outward in several directions at once. Financial markets responded almost immediately. Oil traders around the world recalculate risk every time tensions escalate in the Strait of Hormuz, because the waterway typically carries roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil traffic. Shipping data from trade intelligence firms reportedly showed transits through the strait falling to some of their lowest levels of the year, with only a fraction of the normal daily crossings still taking place. Then, on July 14th, Washington escalated again. CENTCOM resumed a full naval blockade against vessels transiting to and from Iranian ports and coastal areas, a measure it had already enforced once before, between mid-April and mid-June, redirecting more than 100 compliant vessels and disabling several that refused to comply. President Trump briefly floated the idea of charging commercial shippers a fee for safe passage through the strait, before reversing course and instead pointing to what he described as major new trade and investment commitments from Gulf states. Iran's response followed a familiar pattern. Officials publicly refused to acknowledge losing ground even as the evidence mounted. Iranian state media claimed an American drone had been shot down near Bandar Abbas, a claim intended to reassure a domestic audience, even as 3 sea drones had just successfully struck a major naval facility only miles away. Iran's deputy foreign minister said the renewed American pressure had effectively dismantled the memorandum both sides had signed weeks earlier. At the same time, Iranian forces launched their own wave of retaliatory attacks against American-linked positions across the region, strikes reportedly aimed at installations in Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. Kuwait's military said one of its own naval vessels was struck, injuring several personnel, while its air defenses intercepted a mix of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones aimed at military and civilian sites. Some of Iran's projectiles were reportedly intercepted, some caused real damage. And in the middle of a conflict now dominated by headlines about autonomous weapons and precision strikes, the human cost on the ground has continued to accumulate on both sides. So what does all of this actually mean going forward? Why should anyone outside a defense analyst's office care about 3 small unmanned boats hitting one facility on one night? Because this is one of those moments that looks small in isolation, but represents an enormous shift once you zoom out. For decades, naval power has largely meant big, expensive, heavily crewed vessels. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, submarines. Ships that take years to build, cost billions of dollars, and put thousands of sailors in harm's way every time they deploy into contested waters. The rise of cheap, autonomous, one-way attack vessels doesn't replace that traditional navy, at least not anytime soon. But it fundamentally changes the math. A single Iranian fast attack boat, the kind Iran has used repeatedly to harass shipping in the strait, can reportedly cost several $100,000, sometimes more, depending on its configuration. A one-way attack sea drone built specifically to destroy something like that costs a fraction of that price, and it never has to survive the mission to be considered a success. That's the same brutal logic that has already reshaped conflicts from Ukraine to the Red Sea and is now reshaping the Persian Gulf. But here's the part of this story that connects directly back to why the Pentagon accelerated this program in the first place. This capability wasn't built with Iran specifically in mind. It was built with an eye toward the Pacific, toward the possibility of a future confrontation involving a much larger, much more capable rival navy. Analysts have pointed to the widening numerical gap between the size of the Chinese fleet and the size of the American fleet as one of the driving forces behind the Pentagon's push to field cheap, fast, scalable unmanned vessels instead of waiting years for new destroyers to roll off the line. In that sense, Iran has become something like a live-fire proving ground for a weapon system built with a much bigger rival in mind. Every lesson learned in the Strait of Hormuz, what works, what doesn't, how these vessels perform against a real adaptive enemy, gets fed back into a program that will likely shape how the United States Navy operates for the next generation. That's the sobering thought worth sitting with for a moment. The vessels that struck Bandar Abbas this week are, in a very real sense, a rehearsal, a test run for a capability that may end up mattering just as much, if not more, in a completely different ocean someday. And there's a strange kind of symmetry buried inside all of this, if you think about it. For years, Iran's entire naval doctrine in the Gulf has been built around using cheap, fast, numerous small boats to threaten much larger and more expensive American and Allied vessels. It was Tehran's version of an equalizer, a way to make the world's most powerful navy think twice before operating too freely in the strait. Now the United States has effectively adopted a version of that same playbook and turned it back on Iran's own infrastructure. The hunter has, in a sense, become something being hunted by its own hunting strategy, just executed with more resources, more technology, and so far, considerably more success. Nobody knows exactly how the next few weeks unfold. Iran's leadership has shown no consistent pattern of backing down after individual setbacks, even significant ones. And there remain real, unresolved questions about the chain of command inside Tehran as this conflict grinds on. But what does seem increasingly clear is this: the introduction of sea drones into this fight isn't a one-time demonstration. Task Force 59 has been building toward this capability since at least March. The Pentagon evaluated multiple manufacturers specifically to make sure this technology could scale, and CENTCOM's own language, describing this as a new addition to an already expanding strike package, strongly suggests this was the beginning of a sustained capability, not a single message meant to be sent once and then quietly forgotten. If that's true, then the maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas may end up being remembered as the first target on a much longer list. Every submarine pen, every small boat harbor, every coastal repair yard along Iran's southern coastline just became reachable in a way it wasn't a week ago, by a weapon that's quiet, fast, difficult to detect, and doesn't ask a single sailor to risk their life to deliver it. It's also worth understanding just how quickly this entire category of weapon has moved from theory to battlefield reality, because the timeline is genuinely remarkable. Unmanned surface vessels aren't new. Navies have experimented with remote-controlled boats for decades, mostly for minesweeping or harbor security. What changed in just the last few years is the arrival of 3 things at once: cheap, reliable autonomy software, inexpensive commercial components that make these boats affordable to build in real numbers, and a proven combat template, courtesy of Ukraine, showing exactly how devastating the approach can be against a far larger conventional navy. Before Ukraine's Black Sea campaign, most naval planners still thought of unmanned surface vessels primarily as support tools, useful for scouting and logistics, not something you'd trust to carry out an actual strike. Ukraine changed that assumption almost overnight. American defense planners studied that outcome closely, and the shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened alongside a broader rethinking of naval strategy, driven largely by concerns about how quickly rival shipyards were outpacing America's own production timelines. It's also unusual, historically, for the Pentagon to confirm a brand new weapons capability this openly while it's still actively in use. New American military technology typically stays classified for years before officials acknowledge it, often only after outside analysts piece together evidence from satellite imagery. CENTCOM's decision to announce the sea drone strike within roughly a day, complete with video, target details, and the number of vessels involved, suggests this wasn't just a battlefield tactic. It was also a message, aimed as much at Tehran and at rival powers watching from Beijing and Moscow as at the American public. The message is straightforward enough to understand without any special expertise. The United States now has a functioning, combat-tested capability to strike coastal and maritime targets using cheap, autonomous vessels, and it's willing to use that capability whenever the situation calls for it. For a regime that has spent years relying on the assumption that its coastline offered a degree of natural protection against anything short of a full airstrike, that message lands especially hard. Very little along Iran's coastline remains genuinely safe now, regardless of how it's defended against traditional air threats. None of this guarantees how the broader conflict resolves. Wars tangle up with fragile ceasefires, competing negotiations, and deep uncertainty about who's actually making decisions on the other side rarely follow a clean, predictable script. But it does help explain why 3 small, unmanned boats hitting one maintenance facility has generated so much attention from analysts who spend their careers thinking about the future of naval warfare. It's not really about what happened at Bandar Abbas specifically. It's about what that strike confirms is now possible, and about how quickly that possibility is likely to keep expanding in the months ahead, both in the Persian Gulf and in every other contested body of water where American forces might eventually need to operate. That's the story of the weapon Iran never saw coming. Not a single dramatic superweapon unveiled with fanfare, but a quiet, patient buildup of unmanned technology. Tested in one war, refined in a defense lab, deployed for the first time in a rescue mission that saved American lives, and then turned, weeks later, into a strike weapon that opened an entirely new front in a conflict still far from over. Whatever happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, one thing has already changed for good. The water itself is no longer neutral ground. And for the first time in American military history, that shift didn't come from a jet, a missile, or a submarine. It came from 3 small boats, with nobody on board, moving quietly across the dark, doing exactly what they were built to do.